Hello and welcome back to my YouTube channel. My name's Louise, if you haven't been here before, and today's video is going to be the next instalment in my book club series, which is a series that I've made a couple of videos on before, but it's something that I really want to focus on this year, and I really want to talk more this year about the books that have really influenced how I think and the books that I think are really important. And the book that I want to talk about today is This is Vegan Propaganda by Ed Winters. This is a book that came out really recently. It came out on the 6th of January and I've already read it and I'm already wanting to talk about it, and it's obviously about veganism. I'm going to split this video into 3 sections. Firstly, I want to talk about my relationship with veganism and also my thoughts about this creator, because this is a creator that I followed for a long time and obviously therefore I'm biased when it comes to this book. So I want to start this video by talking about that and being, open and honest about my biases when it comes to this book. Secondly, I'm going to give you a brief summary of the book. There's 9 chapters in total, I think, and I'll just give you a quick overview of what each chapter is about and what this book contains. And then lastly, I will finish by giving you my thoughts on this book and whether I think it's a good book or not, and whether I think you should read it or not, who I think should read it, etc. Okay, so without any more rambling, let's get into the first section of this video and talk about my thoughts towards veganism and my thoughts towards this creator and my biases towards this book. So if you've been following me online, you will know that I have been eating a plant-based diet for about 2.5 years now, I think. I would refer to my diet as plant-based because it's not been entirely vegan or even entirely vegetarian. While I don't eat animal flesh or meat anymore, I do still occasionally eat things like gelatin or rennet, just because they're hidden in foods and they're hard to avoid. And personally, I loved sweets. Sweets was one of the biggest things that I knew was going to be difficult to give up for me, so I do still occasionally allow myself to eat sweets that have gelatin in them, although I'm trying to do that less, as I'll talk about in a second. And then I try not to eat dairy and things. Like, I haven't bought a carton of milk or a block of cheese in years, but I do still sometimes buy like pastries or chocolate or other things that contain milk and eggs, and I'm definitely not perfect when it comes to that regard. And actually I noticed that towards the end of 2021 I was eating a lot more of these things. I was eating lots of chocolates and sweets and snacks, and that has more to do with my mental health and the fact that I tend to comfort eat when I'm struggling with my mental health, but I noticed that I was slacking a lot when it came to being vegan or eating a plant-based diet or whatever you want to call it. I don't believe that people need to be perfect when it comes to veganism. I really like this idea that, we should all be striving to be 90% vegan or 95% vegan, because that's a lot more manageable for most people. And I personally think it's okay if my diet is 95% vegan instead of 100% vegan. But I noticed that towards the end of 2021, I was eating a lot more animal products than I would like to. And so for that reason, I decided that this month I was going to attempt to do Veganuary. And my intentions with doing Veganuary is this idea that I wanted to, for lack of a better word, like renew my vows towards the ideology of veganism, and to renew my vow to eat as few animal products as realistically possible. So I was striving to be 100% vegan in January, but I also was going to allow myself to make mistakes, and what I did was I kept a list on my phone, and I think so far I've slipped up like 5 times this entire month, and most of those, as I say, it was because something had milk powder in it or something had a tiny bit of cheese in it. But anyway, this experience of doing Veganuary and trying to be 95% vegan instead of 80% vegan has really reminded me, has really shown me that it is possible, and so that's my goal going forwards, is to be 95% vegan. But another thing that I wanted to do this month was to read this book. And I knew this book was coming out because I've been following this creator for a while, which I'll get onto in a second. But I decided that I wanted to read it in January as part of my Veganuary experience. I decided that in Veganuary I was going to, really make an effort to make my diet as vegan as possible, but that I was also going to read this book. Because I think that's what a lot of people miss when it comes to Veganuary, is that it's easy for us to make these changes in our diet, but I think actually taking the time to educate yourself and read vegan propaganda is just as important, because it really renews your motivation and your sense of purpose when it comes to that. January really felt like a reset for me when it comes to my journey towards being vegan, because I reset my diet, but I also wanted to reset my motivation, and that's why I chose to read this book this month, because motivation when it comes to things like this is so important, and I think it's also really important that we are constantly remotivating ourselves. I think we're surrounded in the world by so much propaganda that tells us to eat meat, and we also live in a world where it's so easy to eat meat that it's easy for us to fall out of the habit of being vegan and vegetarian. I think that's why a lot of people fail. I know many people in my life who have watched a documentary like Cowspiracy, for example, and then being like, right, I'm becoming vegetarian, I don't want to eat animal products anymore. And it lasts for about 6 months, and then they slowly start eating animal products again, and then, you know, a couple of years down the line, it's as if it never happened. And I think the reason that happens is because that motivation wore off. And I think it's important when we live in a world where the default is to eat animal products that we're constantly remotivating ourselves. And so that's why I think it's important for me as someone who is trying to be vegan to constantly be reminding myself why being vegan is important. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about in this introduction is the author and my thoughts towards him. So this book was written by a man called Ed Winters. He also goes by Earthling Ed online a lot. And he has been making vegan content for the last 5 years or so. And I've been following him for maybe 1 or 2 years. And I have to say that he gets a huge amount of credit when it comes to my motivation to be vegan. He is probably the reason that I am vegan today. Like, I do wonder if it were not for this man and his content, would I be vegan? And I honestly don't know, because I'd seen documentaries and those had definitely shown me why I needed to, you know, reduce my meat content and start eating less meat. But it's been his content is really what's fueled my passion for not eating animal products. And what I love about his content is that it's calm and understanding and reflective and insightful, but it always comes down to this bottom line of there is no excuse for eating animals. Watching his videos and seeing him have all of these conversations with different people and seeing how no matter what argument he was presented with, he was able to rationally and calmly explain why veganism is the best option was really what, you know, motivated me, because he's had so many different conversations with people where they talk about so many different arguments about whether or not we should eat animals, and in every single one he explains why veganism is better. And watching those videos really fueled me to be to try to eat a plant-based diet. And as I said before, this, you know, constant need to be motivating ourselves is partly why I love his content, because he makes YouTube videos most weeks, and I found that having a video in my subscription box to watch every single week would keep me motivated, you know, because I was constantly being reminded of the reasons why veganism is so important. Even if I already knew these reasons, it's important to watch them every single week and to be reminded of that. And so I've been an avid supporter of him for the last year or so at least. I pay him a few pounds on Patreon every month. I bought a t-shirt, which some of the money went to his organisation, which is called Surge. They recently set up a sanctuary, which makes me so happy. I follow on Instagram, it's called Surge Sanctuary, where they rescue and look after farmed animals, and I often give them money whenever they have a fundraising drive. For example, recently they were trying to buy some mud control slabs, I think they're called, and I gave them like £20-30 towards that. So I am biased in that regard, but I'm biased for a reason, because I really like this man's content. So I'm going to talk about this book objectively, and I'm going to talk about what I liked about it and what I didn't like about it, but you know, it's important for me to go into this saying I am biased towards the content creator, but that's because I think he's an awesome content creator. It's not because I know him personally or because any other reason, it's because I love his content is why I'm biased, if that makes sense. Okay, so now let's get into the main section of this video. I'm going to give you a summary of this book and what it includes. So this book is split into 3 sections, and then each of those 3 sections has 3 chapters or subsections within that. So I have my laptop here with my notes. The first section of this book is called It's a Question of Morality, and it's all about whether it's ethical or moral to eat animals. And then the first chapter within this section is called Veganism is the Moral Baseline, and it really explains why being vegan is this fundamental moral baseline. And what I loved about this chapter is that it almost reads like you're reading a philosophy text. It really just is this thing of like exploring different ideas and different arguments and putting them together to explain why veganism is an imperative. And the main thing he talks about is this idea of speciesism, which was coined by a guy called Peter Singer, who actually wrote another book that I talked about in an earlier book club episode. but it's this idea that we treat farm animals differently because we see them as others. It's similar to racism, say, but it's about speciesism. You know, we treat farm animals differently just because they are others, and that there's no reason for doing that. He explains that, you know, even if we believe animals are, you know, below us in the rank of importance because, you know, they can't communicate and they're not as intelligent, surely we don't think they're so far below us that we would want to, you know, treat them poorly, kill them for their meat, eat them. Surely we don't believe they're so far down the ranks that that's acceptable. Even if we think they're 1 or 2 ranks below us, surely they're not so far below us that we would want to give them these awful lives and torture them and kill them. You know, you read this chapter and you come away thinking, you're right, veganism is a moral imperative. It's hard to read this chapter and not come to that conclusion. However, I will say my main critique of this book, which I'll talk about more at the end, but is really obvious in this chapter, is the fact that this is the first chapter that you're thrown into when you read this book, and it is ruthless, almost. There is no room in this book or in this chapter for eating meat, and I do worry that people who read this book who eat meat will be very put off by this, because it doesn't lead you in gently, it drops you straight in the deep end. The second chapter of this book is called Our Past Shows Us Why Veganism Must Be Our Future, and this is all about how farming, and especially the way that we farm animals today, is just not natural at all. A lot of people say that, you know, eating meat is really natural and it's something that we've done for, you know, centuries, and there's nothing wrong with it because we've been doing it forever, we need to do it to survive. And what this chapter explains is that there is nothing natural about livestock and the way that we eat animals today. You know, the way that we treat animals today involves selective breeding, artificial insemination, mutilations. They're kept in, you know, warehouses, and it's just not natural at all, and so it really destroys the argument that eating animals is natural. And then the third chapter of this book is called There's No Such Thing as a Happy Farm Animal. The first bit of this chapter I found really interesting, and it talked about how, for example, in the UK we have a thing called the Red Tractor Scheme, and it's this label that you often see on animal products that is meant to insinuate that these animals have been treated well and that they've met a certain set of conditions. The Red Tractor Scheme has you know, a set of conditions that these farms need to meet in order to get that label, and so it's meant to give you this assurance that the meat is high quality and that these animals have been treated well. And what this chapter explains, and I hadn't realised, is that that scheme is owned by the National Farmers Union, and so therefore it's obviously not true, because when farmers are controlling this scheme, how do we expect it to be reliable? And there have been many, many cases where this scheme, the people that work for this scheme have gone and done audits, and they've said, yep, this farm is good, and then later other investigators or, you know, other agencies have gone and done investigations and found that this farm is violating loads of practices. And so it's not reliable, and that's a common issue within the animal industry, within the animal agriculture industry, is that there's so much bias going on, and so many of these organisations are secretly linked, and it's just not reliable. The other fact that I found really interesting is that RSPCA, which is the Royal Society of Prevention Against Cruelty to Animals, have a scheme to do with farming, and they can you know, certify meat as being humane, or they have their scheme where they claim to do that. And this book firstly talks about how ludicrous that is. How on earth can a organisation who claim to be against the cruelty of animals claim that any meat or animal products are humane, first of all? But second of all, they are quite lenient, and their protocols that they want farms to practice are not as stringent as they could be. And there was one statement where a guy said that it's got to be commercially viable, and so this idea that, you know, we can't increase the well-being of these animals if it comes at a cost to the farmers, and so, you know, we're only focused on things that are free for the farmers to do, and it's just a complete hypocrisy. And I found that really interesting to read about. And then they also talked about human conditions, and this is something that I'd probably want to make a whole video about at some point or talk more about, but this idea that firstly in the fishing industry loads of people have their human rights violated, there's loads of slavery within the fishing industry, and secondly people who work in slaughterhouses are just treated awfully. I didn't even realise that they also, as well as, you know, working in a slaughterhouse causing mental health problems and PTSD, etc., there's also loads of human rights violations, such as like danger, lack of safety, low wages, being forced to work overtime, things like that is apparently also rife in the slaughterhouse industry, and it's just absolutely absurd. I remember seeing this thing on the news a few months ago that really shook me about how they wanted prisoners to work in slaughterhouses because no one else wants to, and that's a whole separate issue, but this idea that like working in a slaughterhouse is just not something that anyone wants to do. Like I can't imagine anyone I know being like, oh yeah, I want to go work in a slaughterhouse. And someone has to do it, and it often ends up being people who, you know, can't afford any other job, and in a lot of places it's immigrants who, you know, can't get any other job, and so they're forced to work in these awful conditions. And so there's all of that going on. And then the second half of this chapter is about how poorly these animals are treated, and I have to be honest with you that I skipped most of this chapter. I started reading it and then I just couldn't, because it is just about how cruelly these animals are treated. I think it's important that that exists in text and in documentaries. For example, it's similar to if you've watched Earthlings, like these really horrendous conditions. I think it's important that that is documented for people to understand just how crazy what is going on is. But as someone who already knew that that was happening, I just personally couldn't really read it. It was too distressing for me. But that's because I'm 2 years down, you know, in my veganism journey. I think it's important that it's in the book, but I would put a big trigger warning here that this chapter could be really distressing. And then we get to the second section of this book, which is called Playing with Fire, which is all about the planet. So the first chapter within this is called Our Best Chance to Protect the Planet, and this is all about climate change and about how the animal agriculture industry is causing climate change, causing a lack of biodiversity, and causing deforestation, etc, etc. There are many stats and statistics that I wrote down in my notes, and I'm not going to bore you with them or go through them, but they are all staggering and mind-blowing to read, and this chapter really explains that, you know, livestock is one of the biggest causes of climate change and detriment to our planet. And what I think that has been done really well in this chapter is that he really explains all of these different things. He explains why it's causing climate change, why it's causing deforestation. He goes into all these different arguments, you know. We often talk about how soy farming is causing deforestation, but he explains how most of that soy is going towards cattle feed, and how, you know, if we just ate that soy, we wouldn't need anywhere near as much. And all these different things. So this chapter was mind-blowing to read, and it's definitely the chapter that I took the most notes on, just because there were so many staggering facts that really blew my mind. But it really drove home this idea that, you know, the world has become an animal farming factory. It is destroying the planet. So much biodiversity has been lost in the interest of animal agriculture. The next chapter within this section is called Veganism Could Save Your Life. And this, I think, was probably the most impactful chapter for me to read, and the one that I knew the least about, and the one that was most interesting to learn about, which is all about pandemics, which obviously after or during COVID-19 is a very poignant thing to read. And basically what this chapter explains is that COVID-19 is nothing, and that there are far worse viruses that exist that could become pandemics. This chapter is specifically about zoonotic diseases, because obviously that's what relates to animal farming. A zoonotic disease is a disease that starts in another animal and has made its way to humans and becomes, you know, a dangerous disease. So there's a lot of viruses that exist within other animals that exist in harmony. So these diseases can, you know, live in harmony with the animals. These animals aren't really affected by these diseases. They've reached like an equilibrium state. But what happens is those wild animals interact with farm animals, and farm animals living in the conditions they do are basically petri dishes for these diseases to change and mutate. You know, the diseases go from being in these wild animals to being in our farmed pigs, and they mutate like crazy, and then they become something that we as humans can catch, and they become something that can spread far more easily. A lot of the times these viruses and diseases aren't things that spread very easily, but then once they get into this petri dish of animals, they mutate, they become far more easily to spread, they become far more damaging to humans in particular, and they become things that can really impact human health. And that is what people think happened with COVID-19, although it's not been confirmed yet. But this book does go through examples in history, such as like SARS and foot and mouth disease and things, and he explains where those come from. And the harrowing thing that he explains in this chapter is that there have been some instances of viruses that have come from other animals that have made it to humans that have been absolutely horrendous. I think the main example he uses is one that was called H5N1, and the symptoms that caused were absolutely horrendous. But luckily it wasn't very good at transmitting from humans to humans, so only a handful of people died of it. But if that disease and virus continues to mutate and it finds its way back into humans again in the future, it could be, horrendous, because we were very lucky that when it jumped from animals to humans, it wasn't very good at passing from humans to humans. But say in 10 years' time, or even less than that, that jump might happen again, and by then it might have mutated to a point where it's good jumping from humans to humans. And so we really could be in for some not fun pandemics. And he explains in this chapter that, it's this petri dish of animals, and the fact that we have animals that we're living in such close quarters with, and also the fact that we keep these animals in such horrendous conditions where diseases are rampant, that's putting us at such a big risk. And he explains how if we were to stop animal farming tomorrow, we would reduce our likelihood of having more pandemics by, an insane amount. It really would reduce the likelihood of having future pandemics. And pandemics are one of the biggest issues that face humans, probably second to climate change. It's the biggest threat that we face as a species, and we are causing that. We could stop that tomorrow if we stopped animal farming. We could stop the biggest threat to humans tomorrow, and we don't choose to do that. And that was really interesting to read about, because it's something that I knew a little bit about, but having it all laid out and reading it, I was like, yeah, that's not good. As I say, I knew that about zoonotic diseases and that farm animals were making it worse, but I didn't realise the extent to which it happened and just how bad it was, and just how direct that link was between animal farming and pandemics. Like, I knew sometimes that happened, but this book explains that no, animal farming is the biggest reason why pandemics are going to be an issue in the future. And then the next chapter is called The Healthy Choice, and it's about the health impact of eating a vegan diet. And it does two things. Firstly, it explains how a vegan diet can be complete and nutritious and contain, all the different food groups and vitamins and minerals that we need, which is obviously something that people have a lot of arguments about. It talks about B12 and omega-3 and, how we can get those things on a vegan diet. But it also talks about the health implications of eating animal products, which I think is a really interesting thing. And personally, I agree that there are health implications to eating animal products, and that we would be a lot healthier if we ate a vegan diet. But I am aware that it's such a difficult thing to find reliable information on, because there's so much bias on both sides. You have the animal farming industry who are funding studies that prove that being vegan is unhealthy and that animal products are good for you, and then you also have research that's funded by vegans that says that being vegan is healthy for you and eating animal products is healthy for you, and eating animal products is bad for you. And it's so difficult to know which is the correct answer. And I think it's something that we definitely are probably going to see more research emerging about in the future. But I am always wary when I talk about this that someone is going to direct me to a study that says, eating animal products is good for you. And I don't deny that those studies exist, and I am very aware that it's such a difficult thing to talk about at the moment because there's so much bias in the science on both sides. So I personally agree with this idea that, being vegan is the healthiest option for you. And this book definitely agrees with that and lays out all the arguments for that. And I think it's important that exists. Why shouldn't, these arguments and these scientific studies exist? But I do still think that in, 2022, it's such a difficult thing to talk about because there's so much bias within the science and the research that's being done on this. I think it's important to be wary when you talk about veganism, that I think that's the area that still has the most contention about it. For example, when it comes to talking about climate change, it's easy to explain why veganism is causing climate change, and I don't think those things are deniable any longer. But I think it's still possible for people to deny the health implications of eating meat, and that's something that we need to do more research on. But that's what that chapter is about, and I think if it's something you've never heard about, it will be really interesting to hear all of these different arguments for why eating animals is really bad for you, and also just these arguments of why eating a vegan diet can be healthy. I think that's undisputable. It's possible to eat a healthy vegan diet, and so with all the other things in mind, why wouldn't you do that? It's at least the bottom line anyway. And then the third and final section of this book is called Breaking Down the Barriers. And the first section in this book is called How Psychological Barriers Influence Us, and this is all about the psychological barriers that keep us eating animals and prevent us from being vegan. So for example, they talk about this idea that if slaughterhouses had glass walls, we'd all be vegetarian, and how so much of what is happening in the animal industry is hidden from us. There was a really interesting study, I can't remember if it was mentioned in this chapter or in an earlier one, where they interviewed just the public and they asked them like, which of these practices do you think are humane and acceptable? And a lot of people said that, you know, these practices are not okay, we shouldn't be doing these to animals even if we want to eat them. And it turned out that those are the practices that are being used all of the time, and people just don't realise how animal farming is happening, and people don't realise the extent to which these animals are being tortured, essentially. We just don't know what's going on because it's hidden from us. We go to the supermarket and we're sold these happy images of farm animals, and it's just not true. You know, we call them livestock, which implies that they are a commodity. We call it beef instead of cow, all these little things, and this chapter talks about how all of those little things encourage us to maintain the status quo of eating animals, rather than to be vegan, which I think is an important thing to talk about because it explains why we eat animals. You know, why do we as humans who have these moral imperatives, for example, most people would say that animal cruelty is wrong, but why do people who say animal cruelty is wrong eat animals? And I think this chapter does a good job of at least starting to explain that. And then the next chapter is called We Have Nothing to Fear from Institutional and Media Bias, and this is furthermore about how the media and the animal agriculture industry flood us with propaganda that encourages us to eat meat. For example, did you know that loads of supermarkets come up with fake farms? So Tesco's have a range of meat that claims to be from Woodside Farms, and that's just a complete lie. Like, there is no such thing as Woodside Farms, and they do that to make you have this sense that it's coming from these like small, well-owned, well-run farms, and it's just not true. And this chapter explains why we're surrounded by so much propaganda to eat meat, and how insane that is, that these companies are allowed to flood our media and our advertising with false claims. And then the last chapter in the section is called Talking About Veganism, and this I found really interesting. Ed Winters has also written an ebook, which is called something like 30 non-vegan excuses and how to respond to them. And I would also really recommend reading that ebook. It's designed for vegans to help them talk to their non-vegan family and friends. And in that ebook, he goes through every single argument that people have, or like the most common arguments people have for why they aren't vegan and why they eat animal products, and explains how you should respond to them. And that I think is really interesting. And I do wish that had been included more in this book. I think there's a lack of that in this book. But what I found really interesting about this chapter that's called Talking About Veganism is it talks about how being vegan can be really difficult, and I think that was a really nice way to end this book, especially for me as someone who is already on my journey towards being veganism. It made me reflect on how difficult I found it to talk to other people. For example, I seem to have reached this like equilibrium or status quo point with most of my family and friends where they respect my wish to eat a plant-based diet, but they don't want it enforced upon them. And actually, you know, I believe that we should all be vegan, and I want to do a better job of talking to other people about it, not in a judgmental way, but trying to explain to other people why eating less animal products is so important and to encourage them to do so, and why that's so difficult and why it can cause this dissonance between family and friends, because it's such a difficult thing. Like, eating food is something that we do at least 3 times a day and something that we're constantly surrounded by. And I just found it really nice, almost it felt like solidarity, and this chapter reminded me and explained why it's so difficult, and it was very comforting to read that. And I think it's also something that's so important to talk about, especially amongst the vegan community. You know, how do we encourage more people to become vegan when it's such a difficult thing to talk about? And then the outro to this book is called A Vegan World Will Be Better for Everyone, and it talks, you know, it just reminds you of all these different reasons why a vegan world would be better for everyone. And I think this book ended on a really positive note, this idea that, you know, we've made mistakes throughout history as a species, and eating animals is one of those, and it's time for us to change, and we shouldn't be put off from making that change because of shame or because, you know, embarrassment of how we've done that for the last centuries. Instead, you know, we should come together, and what's so good about our species is our capacity to, you know, make these important decisions and how humans are defined by, or how humans, you know, want to and can be defined by their ability to make progress, and how eating a plant-based diet should be our next step towards making progress. And I think it just ended on this really positive, note, He's like, the world needs to become vegan, but that's a good thing, and we're going to manage it, and it's going to be good, because we're going to come together, and it might not happen tomorrow, obviously, it will take a bit longer, but we're capable of this, and we should look at it as a positive thing. We shouldn't let our shame deter us from doing what's right and what's important for the future. So, that's my summary of this book. Okay, so that was my summary of this book, and now I want to end this video by reflecting on my thoughts and feelings about it, whether I thought it was a good book or not, and who I think I would recommend this book to. So for me, I really enjoyed this book. As someone who is, already deeply on their journey for being veganism, this book was so important to read because it renewed my motivation, and it really just laid out all these different arguments to me. This book almost felt like something of a textbook. It was quite a dry and difficult read in places, but it felt like reading, a textbook. And I think for me, it's going to be something that I constantly refer to. I read it on Kindle, but I highlighted loads of it. I took loads of notes, and I know that this is going to be a text that I constantly refer to, and that I reread whenever I, need to renew my motivation. And it's going to be a tool that I hopefully use to help educate other people. But yeah, so I think what's really good about this book is that it just left no stone unturned. It really talked about all of these different arguments, and I think the way that it was broken down into chapters was so important. As I said, the only thing I think that was missing from this book is, how to respond to non-vegan arguments, but as I said, he's already written a separate book about that, but I almost felt like that could have been incorporated into this book. But other than that, every single argument for being vegan was uncovered in this book, that, each chapter focused on one of these things and explained in so much depth with so many sources. There are like 50 pages of references in this book, and I trust that this man and that his team have done an incredible job of researching and referencing and sourcing the information in this book, and so it's not made up. There is so many, facts and statistics. The second thing that I enjoyed about this book was how readable it was. Like I said, it does come across like a textbook in the sense that it is dense and full of information, but it's also readable. And I was able to read this book in a few different over a few sittings. And there's nothing in this book that is hard to understand, and it doesn't use language that's difficult. Anyone could read this book and understand the contents of it. And the third thing that I really loved about this book was how ruthless it is in its acknowledgement that veganism is the answer. There is no room in this book for an argument that eating animals is correct. And then the things that I didn't really love about this book is, firstly, as I said, I think this book would be really difficult to read if you aren't already on a journey towards being vegan. I would not hand this book to any of my family and say, read this. I would hand them instead Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer, which I will make another episode on, I promise, in the coming months. But that is the book I would not hand them this book, because this book felt judgmental, almost. As I said, because there's no room in this book for eating animals, even though I think this book isn't trying to be judgmental and it never attacks people, it's so ruthless in its argument towards veganism that I think people who do eat meat currently would be so put off by this book. I don't think it would encourage them. I think it would just be too much for them. So this definitely isn't a beginner book. It's, I think, too judgmental, and I think it could have done a better job of being more inclusive and forgiving of people who eat meat, because the author of this book ate meat for 18 years, and he explains why that's wrong, and he does explain that, but I think there needs to be this acknowledgement that some people can't go vegan overnight. I think that's what was missing from this book. He explains how he was eating meat, and then he became vegetarian, and then he became vegan. But it almost comes across as if those were two, pinpoint decisions that happened in his life. And maybe that was the case for him, but for me, it's been a much more gradual journey, and I think that's something that there needs to be room for. And that's the other issue that I had with this book, is that I personally think it's okay to be 90% vegan, or 95% vegan, or whatever you're capable of, because it's really difficult to be vegan. Eating animals is so entrenched in our culture, and as I say, for me, it's things like going into Sainsbury's and wanting to buy some snacks. So few snacks are vegan. Every biscuit, every cake, every chocolate contains animal products, and it's really difficult to be 100% vegan. And so I think that the solution at this present time is that everyone should be 95% vegan. And as we do that, you know, animal products will disappear, and then it will be easy for us to be vegan. But at this current time, in the world that we live in, I think it's perfectly acceptable for people to be 90%, 95% vegan. And that's, you know, where I am and where I would encourage people to be. And this book does not talk about that. And I think that's important, and I do think that's missing from this book. So I think there should have been an extra chapter in this book talking about why it's difficult to be vegan, the fact that we live in a world where, you know, it's really, where we're surrounded by all this bias, where our family encourage us to eat meat. This book talks about that, but it talks about, you know, oh, it's going to be really difficult for you to be vegan, but you should do it anyway. And I think there should have been this acknowledgement that, you know, you can be 90% vegan. But it's also just such a difficult thing, because I understand why the author of this book is like a staunch vegan, and so he probably believes it's wrong to be 90% vegan and not 100% vegan. And so that's why it's not in this book, because the author doesn't believe that, but I personally believe it is, okay? And that's why I would recommend Jonathan Safran Foer's books instead, which I promise I will talk about another day. But yeah, those are my thoughts on this book, and whether I thought it was a good book or not. So, as I said, the people I would recommend this book to are people who are already on this vegan journey. For me, I loved reading this book. It, you know, renewed my motivation, taught me stuff I didn't know, and I think will hopefully make me better at communicating this stuff in the future, because it really laid out these arguments really clearly, and I now think I have a better understanding of these arguments and that I would be able to better vocalise them myself. And it really, as I said, the main thing was just it renewed my motivation to be eating as few animal products as realistically possible. And so for that reason, I would recommend it to people who are, you know, halfway on their vegan journey, and people who are vegan would probably also benefit from this book, because it would help them to communicate with other people. Even if they don't need that renewed sense of motivation, it would still help them with those other things, with being able to communicate with others. And I said that last chapter about how being vegan is really difficult, I did find quite comforting, and I think vegans would find comfort in that chapter. However, I do think vegans would be really put off by the chapter about farm animals, because I said I couldn't read it, and I think a lot of people would find that, especially if you have spent the last couple of years unpacking your speciesism. It's really difficult to read that chapter. And so, yeah, that's the end of this video. Those are my thoughts on this book. I thought this was a really good book and a really important book, but I think it's also important for us to have conversations about this book. As I said, I don't think this book is 100% perfect, and that's fine, no book is. So I think it's important that this book exists, and I'm very glad that it now does, but it's obviously important for us to talk about it. And so I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below, either about, you know, eating animal products in general, or if you've read this book, I would love to hear your thoughts on this book, or if you know this creator and you watch their content, I would love to hear your thoughts. I'm more than happy to discuss them in the comments below. And also let me know what other books you would like to see in this series. As I said, I really want to make an episode about Eating Animals by Jonathan Safran Foer, which is another book about veganism, but is very different, and I would like to talk about that. But I also want to talk about all other kinds of books. I'm currently reading The Story of Stuff, and I want to make a video about that. I want to talk about Are Prisons Obsolete by Angela Davis, a whole range of books. But if you have any suggestions for books that you think I should read based on my interest in, you know, minimalism and sustainability and happiness and productivity, would love to hear that in the comments below. Thank you very much for watching. My name is Louise, and if you want to see more of me, the best place to find me is on Instagram and YouTube at Louise's Life. Thank you for watching.